A couple more seats up front here. All right. Good. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center on this sunny Monday afternoon. Glad all of you could join us. Particularly delighted by what I take are two student groups. I think one's from Georgetown. Where's the other group from? Vienna. Okay. Excellent. Well, welcome to everybody to the Wilson Center, to this History and Public Policy Program event. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy Program here at the Center, as well as the European program, and it's a delight to welcome all of you to this session and discussion of Justin Vaïsse's new book, Neoconservatism, the Biography of a Movement. We, of course, have Justin with us this afternoon to talk about the book. We'll do so for about 20 minutes or so. And then we have two very distinguished colleagues and commentators joining us to give some initial perspectives on the book and on the subject. And then I hope all of you will join in with questions and comments. And I very much hope that the students especially won't be shy, but do ask questions. Just a word on the Wilson Center, since some of you may not have been to this institution before, and since this event is being webcast live. The Wilson Center, of course, is the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, established in 1968, founded to honor and build upon Wilson's legacy as a man who bridged the divide between scholarship and public policy. We at the Center try to bring together the thinkers and the doers, the policymakers, the scholars and business leaders in the hope and in the belief that a frank and open dialogue will lead to better understanding, cooperation, and public policy. Today's event, as part of the History and Public Policy program, very much reflects and exemplifies the Center's commitment to dialogue. Certainly, this afternoon we'll be focusing on one of the main, most important currents in American intellectual history and political thinking, with an important new publication. Let me just briefly introduce our three speakers before I will give Justin the floor to talk about his new book. Justin Vaïsse is a senior fellow in foreign policy and director of research at the Brookings Institution's Center on the United States and Europe. Previously, he served as special advisor to the United States and on the United States and transatlantic relations at the policy planning staff of the French Foreign Ministry. He has authored and co-authored several books, including award-winning book on the Empire of, what is the Empire of the Middle?
Yeah, it was actually a pretty lame metaphor. We're using the Middle Kingdom as a metaphor for the U.S. It didn't work out very well.
Very good. The United States and the world since the end of the Cold War, which he co-authored with Pierre Melandri, and also Washington and the World, co-authored with Pierre Hassner. We then start with, I think in terms of the comments, with James Mann. He is, of course, author in residence at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, CUSE. He's a former Washington correspondent and Beijing bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. He has also a number of books to his credit. Many of you may be familiar with The China Fantasy, How Our Leaders Explain Away Chinese Repression, published in 2007. Rise of the Balkans, importantly for this discussion today, the history of Bush's war cabinet, About Face, a history of America's curious relationship with China, and I could go on. His latest book, just to mention that, is The Rebellion of Ronald Reagan, a history of the end of the Cold War, published just last year, and we were delighted to launch the book here at the Center last fall. Then I have the great pleasure to call on my colleague, Sam Wells. Sam Wells is a senior scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the former associate director of the center and headed a number of programs here, including the West European Studies program. He is a specialist on international security affairs, has published widely on U.S. strategy and transatlantic relations, co-edited a number of books, including The Strategic Triangle, France, Germany, and the Shaping of the New Europe, published in 2006. His latest publication with Cheryl B. Wells is Germany's Choice of Shared Sovereignty in the European Union, forthcoming in a book on history and neorealism, edited by Richard Rosekrantz, Ernest May, and Sarah Steiner. With these brief introductions, let me turn it over to our speakers. Justin, you have the floor.
Thanks. Thanks, Christian. It's really I'm really delighted to be here to present the book, if only because this book has a strong academic side, and what better place than the Cold War International History Project. So what better place than this one to present this side of the book. So the book was published like a month ago, and since then I've been doing mostly commentary on the present state of the neocons, etc. Whereas the book is obviously 90 or 95% concerned with the past, and especially the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And as we were discussing, the book actually began as a PhD dissertation work, which I defended quite a few years ago. In France, and Sam, I'm delighted that Sam is here because he was on the original jury of that dissertation, and so he has read the long version. This is the short version. In French. What's more, the longer version is at least 3 or 4 times as long as that. So it took me a number of years to reduce the size of the study, and of course a lot of updating. I'm also delighted that James Mann agreed to be here. I'm a great admirer of Rise of the Vulcans and other publications, and he was, gracious enough to give me a blurb for that book. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. The reason why I wanted to mention this and the place where we are today is because I do think the book adds to the understanding of American foreign policy during the Cold War. It's really about the sort of the intellectual side of American foreign policy, and it's premised, the book, basically the whole enterprise is premised on a very simple idea, which is that ideas have consequences. The debate in foreign policy in Washington and across the country matters. American foreign policy is not only about electoral calculations, lobbies, economic interests, oil, big strategic thinking. It's also about ideas about America's role in the world. It's also about representations, ideologies, etc. And so I wouldn't have started this book without sort of having that idea in the background. Now to the label neoconservative, obviously labels are great simplifiers. Obviously, no two neoconservatives think the same on all issues, and indeed many of them disagree on quite a lot. But I would say this would be true of most other labels, whether libertarians, liberals, conservatives, etc. What made the study of neoconservatism more tricky is that the very substance of the movement, and even movement is maybe too much of a coherent reality to account for what it really is. What made that study very tricky is that the very substance of neoconservatism changed so much, was so profoundly transformed since it was born in the mid-1960s. Since the mid-1960s, neoconservatism has shifted from domestic issues to foreign policy issues, from the left to the right, and from basically New York intellectuals to, you could say, Washington-based political operatives. And so the end result is that the current state of neoconservatism is really unrecognizable for those who are looking at the 1960s. So to make sense of this complex history, I suggest in the book to look at neoconservatism not as one continuing school of thought in time, but as a succession of three very different families over time, or what I call the ages of neoconservatism. So the first family were the original neoconservatives. The second family were the Scoop-Jackson Democrats of the 70s and 80s, and the third family, obviously, is the latter-day neocons. And let me just walk you through these different steps of the movement, or through the biography of that movement. The first family really is a child of the 1960s. The neoconservatism at birth is the result of a split in liberalism that occurred when some liberals reacted against what they saw as the leftward turn of other liberals in the course of the 1960s. One point of context is that you have to remember that liberalism at that time, between basically the New Deal and the 1960s, was not really synonymous with the left, with the ambition of far-reaching social change. In the 1950s, for example, it was pretty mainstream sort of consensus doctrine that even many Republicans could identify with and live with, certainly nothing radical. But in the 1960s, some developments shattered that liberal consensus. Social movements like student protests, especially against the Vietnam War, the counterculture, black nationalism, radical feminism or environmentalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, government overreach through LBJ's programs, the war on poverty. Basically, what the original neoconservatives reacted against was not, for example, it was not civil rights, of which they had been very strong supporters, but racial quotas and busing in order to speed the process more than they thought was wise. It was, in their eyes, it was not only about social programs based on insurance and oriented towards the middle class, but about social engineering to bring about equality in a way that seemed to these liberals pretty utopian. And so faced with these developments, a group of liberals dissented from that change in the content of liberalism, stressing the limits of social engineering and pointing out the dangers that the egalitarian dreams of the New Left had created for stability, meritocracy, and democracy. And so these intellectuals coalesced around the Public Interest, which was the magazine which was founded in 1965 by Irving Kristol and Daniel Bell, and with people like Nathan Glazer, Simon Matten-Lipset, James Q. Wilson, or Pete Moynihan. And a few years, they also coalesced around Commentary magazine, whose editor was Norman Podhoretz at that time. So these group of intellectuals, they were still liberals, quite distinct from the conservatives, the true National Review conservatives, if you'd like. They were not against all government intervention, but they pointed the limits of what that intervention could achieve. Still, their opponents tagged them with the label neoconservatives to make the point that they were no longer liberals and that they belonged to the conservative camp, trying to sort of banish them from the confines of liberalism. So that's really the first family. As you see, there's a big distance between these and the current day neocons. And the way to bridge the gap is to study in greater depth. And that's, I think, that story of the original neocons, the neoconservatives, the first family that I've just described is well known. I think what the book brings is a better understanding of the second family, the Scoop-Jackson Democrats, especially through different archives that I was able to access. I think I've brought some new elements to that whole story. So the Scoop-Jackson Democrats, the relationship between the first and second family is sort of easy to understand. The fight against, the reaction against the New Left that happened in the realm of ideas in the 60s and early 70s was transposed into politics when George McGovern won the nomination for the presidential election of 1972 to be the candidate against Richard Nixon, and with him came the growing influence of the New Left on the Democratic Party. McGovern was seen, and this is a partly partial view, but it was seen by many traditional Democrats as way too far to the left, both in domestic policy. He supported massive social programs and affirmative action through quotas, and in foreign policy, where he advocated a hasty retreat from Vietnam, deep cuts in the defense budget, and a neo-isolationist sort of grand strategy, if you'd like. And so the reaction against that leftward turn of the Democratic Party happened in different places in the course of the 1970s. In Commentary magazine that I mentioned a moment ago, in Senator Scoop Jackson's office, where Richard Pearl was, and Dorothy Fosdick, but Richard Pearl was really the important legislative aide at that time, in particular helping him to draft and get past the famous Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And the third place was in a group called the Coalition for Democratic Majority, where Democratic operatives like Gene Kirkpatrick, Eugene Rostow, Ben Wattenberg, Joshua Muravchik, Elliot Abrams, and many others tried to steer the Democratic Party back to the center throughout the 1970s. What they wanted to do is to try to get back to the tradition of what they saw as the tradition of Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson, meaning progressive policies at home, but once again, New Deal type programs, and fierce anti-communism abroad, and including the defense of human rights, a theme that was slowly rising in the course of the 1970s, and of fellow democracies, including Israel, which played an important role in their shift, and more generally the reinforcement of American military power, which they saw as dangerously drifting. And this is why they found themselves in the course of the 1970s battling two enemies, a sort of two-side war. On the one hand, on the left, they were battling the New Left inside the Democratic Party, and on their right, they were battling Nixon and Kissinger's policy of détente and accommodation with the USSR that, as you may remember, including de-emphasizing the ideological aspects of the Cold War and engaging Moscow, trying to find common ground, common interest, etc., thereby legitimizing the Soviet regime rather than trying to change it. So why are the Scoop Jackson also called neoconservatives and not Scoop Jackson Democrats? Simply because there were porous borders between the first family and the second one. There were institutions that were shared by the two families, like Commentary magazine, for example, or the American Enterprise Institute, where a number of Democrats went to work in the 1970s. And obviously, more importantly, because they had a common enemy, that is the New Left. To make a long story short, the Scoop Jackson Democrats failed to recapture the soul of the Democratic Party, which in their view remained way too dovish vis-à-vis the USSR, especially under Jimmy Carter. And so, to make a long story short, they went to work in the Reagan administration. Many of them went to work for Reagan, and they did, as a matter of fact, inspire large parts of his foreign policy, including the Reagan doctrine of support for the so-called freedom fighters in Afghanistan and Central America, in Angola and elsewhere, the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, which still exists, the rhetoric about the evil empire, and the military buildup, obviously. But, ultimately Reagan distanced himself from this line, especially during his second mandate, not unlike the way George W. Bush distanced himself from his neoconservative advisors 20 years afterwards, after having embraced many of their recommendations in the first mandate. But on the Reagan part, I'll defer to my neighbor on the left. Let me get to the third family, the neocons. In the mid-1990s, basically everybody was writing obituaries of the neoconservative movement. It was being declared dead, especially because the Cold War had been won. But it's really at that precise moment that a third family of neoconservatives appeared, the ones we call the neocons, who coalesced around the Weekly Standard launched in 1995 by Bill Kristol and Bob Kagan and others, the American Enterprise Institute and the Project for the New American Century, between 1997 and 2006, and figures like Bill Kristol, Bob Kagan, whom I just mentioned, but also Gary Schmidt, Max Boot, Doug Faith, David Frum, and others. So the thing to keep in mind is that the neocons are really the ideological heirs of the Scoop-Jackson Democrats, much more so than the ideological heirs of the first family of the original neoconservatives. But there are still some differences between the Scoop-Jackson Democrats and the current neocons. Well, first, because the newcomers, the younger neocons, were never Democrats or even liberals. They are firmly located within the Republican family. And, if you open the Weekly Standard, for example, there's no big difference on domestic issues between that and what you could read in National Review, for example. It means the fact that they're firmly located in the Republican side means that they somehow have to reconcile their foreign policy stance with with the electoral interests of the Republican Party, and obviously there exist considerable tensions over what to do about foreign policy in the conservative camp and in the Republican Party, especially between these neocons and the libertarians or Tea Party movement activists, etc., over whether the U.S. should go around bashing guys on the head and intervening in different places, or whether it should have a much more restrained foreign policy. So basically the question being, what is a conservative foreign policy exactly? Is it the neocon version or a realist version or even a sort of neo-isolationist one? The second difference between the second family and the third, the Scoop-Jackson Democrats and the neocons, is that America's relative power in the world has considerably increased since the 1970s and 1980s. The Soviet enemy is gone, and America's military force and economic strength are greater than ever, which of course has been a bit less true in the most recent years. So whereas the Scoop-Jackson Democrats were urging Americans not to retreat and to defend democracy and human rights, the neocons can exhort them to advance and act boldly, in other words, to use American power to shape a world safer for all. So I'll conclude with a few words on neoconservatism today. What does that label, what does neoconservatism mean today, and what do neoconservatives believe in? Today, basically, neoconservatism is a school of thought in American foreign policy, and it's no more than that. There is really no more domestic aspects to it. A school of thought, I would argue, that stands in stark contrast to other schools like the realists or the liberals or the neo-isolationists, if you like, and combines at least 5 tenets or 5 principles. The first one is internationalism. It's the belief that America should be active in the world and shape the international order. Otherwise, that order will be shaped by other powers, other nations in ways that could be inimical to the ideals and interests of the U.S. The second principle is primacy. The idea that American hegemony is good for America and is good for the world, and that it should be preserved. The third principle, or third tenet, is unilateralism. It's the skepticism that international institutions, especially the UN, can play any useful role in safeguarding peace. And it's the belief that America, who's the real purveyor of stability, should not be tied down by treaties or international law too much, because these treaties and rules include so many free riders and also obviously so many dictatorships. Think of the UN Security Council, for example, that the only thing that really counts is being able for America to be able to act freely in the world. The fourth principle is tied to the previous one. It's militarism, for lack of a better word. It's the idea that military force remains critical in the current world, and the belief that America should be willing to shoulder its global responsibilities by maintaining a high level of defense spending and a willingness to use force. last but not least, the fifth principle is democracy. It's the idea that defending and promoting democracy is not only the right thing to do in principle. It's not only a tribute to Woodrow Wilson. Obviously, my co-author, Pierre Hassner, dubbed the neoconservatives Wilsonian in boots to sort of make the joke with the revolutionaries in Napoleon having been the French revolutionary with boots, meaning marrying idealism, human rights, etc., on the one hand, with militarism on the other hand. But basically, so it's not just idealism, and it's obviously not just Wilsonianism, but it's also the idea that in the long term, it's the smart thing to do to promote democracy, as democracies tend to be more friendly to the U.S. and less belligerent to the neighbors. So it's not, contrary to what has often been said, they don't have a sort of a cynical view of democracy as window dressing and just a pretext. It's combined with a strategic thinking about long-term, and of course, most of them would argue that the long-term realism is to promote democracy, because in the long term, you cannot buy stability in the expense of democracies, at least in the long term. So that's sort of the five tenets of neoconservatism, and I'll stop here to leave time for the comments and Q&As.
Great, thank you. Jim, would you like to continue?
Thanks. Is this on here? Okay, good. This is a terrific book by Justin and I, which I commend to you. It really is the best and most complete history of the neoconservative movement, and it really adds, I think, to our own understanding of it. Justin has traced through one of the things I think is important, which is the sense of three different generations of neoconservatives and how they differed from one another. And there is an emphasis in the book, I think, that he started with the second generation of neoconservatives in the 1970s, who were Democrats, originally liberal Democrats, gradually becoming alienated with the Democratic Party. And a lot of that is just plain new history that has not been explored before. And I would say that his overall approach, one thing that I like about it is that it matches in approach mine, which is that in looking at things like this, you, as a historian, try to understand. You address the question, what were people thinking? What's the logic? And examine it, rather than simply fill up a book with adjectives that these are bad people. You draw that conclusion, but history is history, and you try to look at the intellectual development of a movement, and that is similar to what I tried to do in my book on the Vulcans, which was a look at the George W. Bush administration's incoming foreign policy team and their roots and their history over the previous decades. And that, in doing that, I explored neoconservatism. Justin has done it as a movement. So this is a terrific long-range history. I first talked to Justin about this book. He came to talk to me, I think it was probably a couple years ago, to question a particular part, one piece of the history that I told in my book, and I'll get to what we disagreed on in a second. But we traded ideas and we traded views, and after this book was finished, he sent me a copy, and I took a look, and I just found it extremely good history. So I really take this as sort of the definitive work on neoconservatism. Now, where we originally disagreed, that's an interesting point. Justin has mentioned the neoconservatives' belief in democracy, and certainly anybody familiar with the Bush administration, George W. Bush, and particularly its latter years in office, would certainly and quickly associate neoconservatives with the cause of democracy. If you go back to the Reagan administration, in its second term, you will find that with great reluctance, Ronald Reagan and his administration gradually decided to withdraw their support from the dictator in the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos. That was a difficult decision, particularly for Reagan. And in the wake of that, neoconservatives began to espouse democracy as sort of an underlying principle of the movement. And by their own self-description, some of them, this was a change, because if you go back to the 70s, to the late 70s in the Carter administration, you will find the frequent critique of Jimmy Carter, the liberal Democrat, that he had pushed too hard for democratic change with some dictatorial governments, notably and most importantly the Shah of Iran and also Somoza in Nicaragua. So in the view of Paul Wolfowitz and some other neoconservatives in the Reagan administration, like Elliott Abrams, this was a change, and the reluctance to push for democracy with dictators in the 70s had been put in theoretical and conceptual terms by another leading neoconservative, Jeane Kirkpatrick, and that the United States was in some way pushing or being unfair to anti-communist dictators or dictatorial regimes like South Korea. So the neoconservatives saw this at the time as a change, and I explored that in my book. What Justin came to point out, and his history certainly describes this part of it, if you go back into the early and mid-'70s, there was certainly an espousal of the ideas of democracy by a leading neoconservative group, Coalition for a Democratic Majority. That is, the Democrats of the 1970s had, in fact, strongly espoused democracy. And so, I come to see this as a democracy as an issue which is on which the movement is inconsistent, and people on all sides of debates in the 70s and 80s are quite inconsistent, because when you look at right-wing regimes that supported the United States, like Iran in the 70s, like the Philippines, South Korea, Somoza's Nicaragua, the neoconservative position was, let's not push too hard for democracy. And then in the late 80s, they came to change. And they changed because, particularly in the Philippines, they came to see that dictatorships could become so corrupt that it could open the way for a communist insurgency. So, and on the other side of the debate, it's true that that liberal Democrats were quite forthright in proposing democratic change for dictatorial regimes, and certainly less assertive in espousing the cause of democracy in Eastern Europe. So I see this as a issue on which no side of the political spectrum could quite overcome the contradictions. Now, let me I want to turn to what I think are two interesting current issues that are raised by this book to give this history some current relevance. One has been mentioned by Justin, but let's take something that seems completely out of the range of what we're talking about. Let's take Obama's health care plan. In the wake of the passage of health care early this year, you found a couple of neoconservatives, Max Boot, for example, writing that that health care, the Obama plan, would weaken American national security. It became one more piece of the attack on Obama, that in some way, by enacting health care, that the Obama administration had somehow compromised America's strength overseas. And I looked at those columns and kind of laughed. Justin's book actually explains that in the 1970s, the neoconservatives, led by certainly Scoop Jackson, Scoop Jackson was a strong proponent of national health care. And he and many of this second generation of neoconservatives were on domestic issues liberal Democrats. So it raises the question, so what happened? What happened to the neoconservative movement between the 70s and 30 years later? Scoop Jackson wasn't completely on his own. Many other neoconservatives agreed with him. Many were Democrats. If you look today at the voter registration rolls, you will find that Jackson's senior aide, now certainly more famous than he is now, Richard Pearl, is a registered Democrat. What happened to make the neoconservatives markedly less liberal, less progressive, hostile to things like health insurance, where they were once supportive? And there are a couple of answers to that, I think. Justin offers one, which is this is just a different generation of neoconservatives, that the current neoconservatives were never Democrats, and that's certainly true. The other is, another is that as time went on, the neoconservatives came to not care about domestic issues so much. And I can tell you as a personal experience, just an anecdote from one of my book interviews. The late Jean Kirkpatrick, before she died, was describing to me how she was one of the first democratic intellectual in the late 70s to switch and endorse Ronald Reagan for president. I guess this was in late 79, early 1980. And I was interviewing her and said, how did that feel? It must have felt kind of strange. You've been hanging around Democratic Party groups, and now you're with Republicans. Did you care about Reagan's positions on taxes, for example? What about on social issues? And she was quite honest and straightforward and said, by that time, by the end of the 70s, I just didn't care that much about domestic issues. I stopped caring so much. I was focused so entirely on foreign policy issues. And another explanation is simply that the neoconservatives, once they became part of the Republican Party, simply were spending more time with other conservatives. But it is interesting to look at how the movement has changed on that. The other question is, what's the future of the neoconservatives? And Justin has addressed this in his book, and writes that it's a strong movement which certainly will continue to have a lot of power. And I generally agree with that. I would argue, I would point out a couple of cautions. The neoconservative movement has first of all, has a strong and coherent point of view. Neoconservatives know what they think. Justin has laid out, I think, the core ideas very well. And whereas you can find, for example, in the Democratic Party, a tremendous ambivalence about some of these issues, the neoconservatives certainly know where they're coming from, what they want to do. They have access. They have some prominent writers. They have access to the media. And so there's an awful lot of ways in which I agree with Justin that the movement will keep on going. I would add that there are two things that make me question the enduring power of the neoconservatives. One is within the Republican Party. That is, there is a strong tension, rarely acknowledged in public, between neoconservative thinking and libertarian thinking. That is, you have a strong group of libertarians whose views on certainly things like taxes and government regulation are well known, but who also believe that the United States should not be spending so much money and should not overseas and should not have so many commitments overseas. I think that was certainly the view of Ron Paul in the last presidential campaign. I assume that that's where his son comes out, and I can see in the way that American domestic politics works. I can see that a time, maybe in the next presidential election or the one after that, where within the Republican Party you get 2, 3, or 4 hawk candidates who are hawks dividing the vote, and a libertarian candidate doing extremely well. The Democratic counterpart to that would be the 1976 election, when 3 or 4 liberal Democrats divide the vote and Jimmy Carter in the center won the nomination. So that's problem number one, that sometimes the neoconservatives are much more hawkish than the grassroots of the Republican Party. And if you get to an election where, say, the United States is still spending an awful lot of money and has an awful lot of troops in Afghanistan, I can see that a libertarian wing of the party would do very well. And then related to that's the political side. On the policy side, I don't think the neoconservatives have come to grips at all with the question of budgetary restraint and fiscal issues. If you go back to the early days of the George W. Bush administration, before September 11th, much less the Iraq War, you'll find that the neoconservative movement was at odds with George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld, because they wanted, the neoconservatives thought that Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld were holding down the defense budget too much. And there were nasty editorials in the Weekly Standard denouncing Rumsfeld and Cheney for failing to stick up for the defense budget. And as recently as this year, you can find where very few people, I think, across the spectrum in the United States would agree. You can find Bill Kristol arguing that the United States is spending not too little money on defense rather than too much. So in a couple of ways, it makes me wonder whether the neoconservatives will find over the coming years that they're increasingly out of step with the Republican Party and with policy debates in this country. And I will leave it there and await the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Sam, now, last but not least, my dear colleagues, you have the floor now.
Thank you. Well, I want to give my bottom line up top and say that I think this book is a tour de force of examining the evolving ideas, the personalities, the alliances that make up these three families or three ages of neoconservatism. You need to be versed in the sources to fully appreciate how much work went into this book, because Justin has opened a lot of doors, pried under a lot of rocks, and discovered some really remarkable connections. I'm pleased that the book is more accessible in its shorter version, but I'm sorry that a good bit of the detail is lost. Justin tells me that he will put on a website for the book some of the things that would interest scholars about the relationships between people, the shifts in positions, and some of the rather numerous inconsistencies in people's individual positions. One thing that he did not mention that I always found fascinating about the first family of neoconservatives was that this group, the central members of this group, had all been part of a Trotskyite cell at the City University of New York in the 1930s. And I had the rather odd historian's opportunity to be sitting at a table with them at a birthday party for Seymour Martin Lipset in the 70s sometime. And they started calling one another by their code names from this Trotskyite cell and telling stories from City College days. And I knew them all at that time as really leading neoconservatives. Some Republicans, most of them at that particular point, were still Democrats. And they went through probably the largest transformation of any of these families in their political views, but they weren't particularly interested in foreign policy. Pat Moynihan was, and Justin's very cautious in categorizing people, but Moynihan, I think, would have always contested the fact of whether he was a neoconservative. He certainly occupied similar positions with neoconservatives much of the time, but Moynihan was sui generis. He moved around, and he followed where his head took him and his heart sometimes. But he was an unusual person, and a person to whom this center owes a great deal, because he was basically the founding father. The second group of neoconservatives show considerable interest in foreign policy because they're concerned with détente, and they're formed to fight what they see is an increasing orientation toward social democratic style accommodation with the Soviet Union and a slippage in our defense budget and preparedness. Another point that Justin doesn't mention is that there is a very strong policy running through the positions of the second and third families of neoconservatives of increasing support after the 1967 war for Israel and for whatever policies the state of Israel adopted as it went through its different forms of government, some more hawkish than others. You can get into, and at an earlier session, some did get into a heated discussion about the extent to which support for Israel is an underlying and perhaps even a determining motif in neoconservative policy positions. Yes, I'm sure Justin can get into that if any of you are interested in discussing it. Starting in 1995, when it appeared that neoconservatism was on life support, There was a revival starting with a small and sturdy band who gradually expanded their influence. They were advocates for spreading democracy. They were advocates for using the strength of the sole superpower to remake the world. And it's interesting, Justin points out that prior to 9/11, the neocons of the group that came to be so important after 9/11 had said very little about terrorism. Terrorism was not on their radar. They weren't concerned with it. And this is doubly unusual because battle against terrorism had been a core issue for Israel. But they, after 9/11, pivoted rather quickly and picked up this issue, helped frame the rhetoric and the concepts of the war on terror, and you have lived through much of the rest of that. One of the things that Justin does in a remarkable way, I think, is to keep individuals and a movement in context. This is particularly difficult for recent history in a highly polarized political environment. I think it's particularly challenging for someone who is not a native American citizen to do it. At an earlier session, Justin was compared to de Tocqueville in having the foreigner's advantage in understanding America. I think there's a good bit to that, although I wouldn't want to burden him with that reputation quite yet. He's got a long way to go. Justin shows a great eye for connections and influences as well as for discontinuities and shifting positions. The book has, for those of you who have a chance to look at a copy, a very useful appendix at the end, pages 284 to 287, in which he charts the general agenda position of each of the families of neoconservatism, the key words and policies that they used and pursued, the primary leaders and spokesmen, the publishing outlets, and who they supported by and large in each of the presidential campaigns. That particular appendix is worth a great deal for those of you who want to catch an overview of shifting positions and leading players. It's also probably going to be very good for trivia questions in future. But, Justin, I would conclude with a couple of questions, somewhat reminiscent of our jury in Paris. In terms of today's conservative politics, where do the leading figures of each of these neoconservative ages stand on an issue that Jim raised, size of government and role in economic affairs, and on national security affairs? I think you've done a pretty good job of laying out national security affairs, but there are some discontinuities. And further, is there any distinction, as you think about it, between the consistency of views of those neoconservatives who had government positions, who were in the policy process, and those who just dealt with their computers and fired off op-eds and blogs? So with that, let me conclude, and we can have discussion.
Thank you very much, Sam. Two excellent comments. Let me perhaps give Justin a chance to respond briefly to a couple of the questions that Sam raised, the democracy issue that Jim raised, and then I'll open it up in a minute to questions and comments from all of you. Justin.
Sure, I'll be brief. A couple of points. Reacting on what Jim said first, one of the great things I discovered during the research was the role of the trade unions in the 1970s in the foreign policy debate, especially the AFL-CIO and Lane Kirkland and George Meany, and the extent to which they had, at that time, the leadership of the AFL-CIO was extremely hawkish and anti-communist, and not only did Meany and Kirkland intervene in the debate, but they also subsidized and gave money to one of the two organizations that I'm well, actually, the two of them, two organizations that I studied in greater depth from, a systematic study of their private archives, the Coalition for Democratic Majority, in order to, for the AFL-CIO, in order to, for the trade union to sort of change the internal dynamics of the Democratic Party and sort of battle the new left. There was a fight at that time between, let's say, the bread and butter Democrats affiliated with AFL-CIO, etc., on the one hand, and the new left on the other hand, who stood for different issues like identity, minorities, personal fulfillment, etc. But also, they gave money and were very active in the Committee on the Present Danger, which is the second organization that I studied, and that Sam actually wrote a piece on the original CPD, Committee on the Present Danger, that of the 1950s. The one I'm studying in greater depth is the second one, the one of the 70s, which grew out of the Coalition for Democratic Majority. And in that, the AFL-CIO was pretty active up until 1981. And so the relationship with what Jim said was that in the early 1980s, when Reagan came to power, of course, that consensus, the Committee on the Present Danger was a bipartisan group, which included obviously Democrats and Republicans, more Democrats than Republicans, but and was able to both business and labor or trade unions. And in the early 1980s, of course, the policies, the domestic policies of Reagan brought that participation of AFL-CIO to the Committee on the Present Danger to a halt, especially for those of you who remember the air controller strike and the firing by Reagan and all the sort of bad blood between the Reagan administration and trade unions. But beyond the specifics, that's a very, very interesting subject that has not really been studied, and that would make for a great PhD dissertation, or actually several of them, I guess. The intervention of trade unions, not only in trade union issues across the world, but also in the foreign policy debate itself. Another thing about, or maybe I should get, in order to leave time for the debate now, address the two questions that Sam put to me. Where do neocons stand on the question of the size of government relative to national security? Well, I would just repeat the words that Bill Kristol said when we launched the book about a month ago at Brookings, and he said, if you think you can preserve peace and preserve world order with just 4.5% of GDP devoted to defense and foreign affairs, then you're dreaming. And so, yes, we should increase the defense budget by quite a bit. We've been advocating, and indeed, in the archives, starting in the early 70s, you wouldn't find 1 year without Scoop Jackson Democrats or neocons advocating for an increase in the defense budget. And so for them, and that ties in with what Jim mentioned about the healthcare debate, there's no doubt that they think that the size of government should be increased, not decreased, in order to put more resources behind foreign affairs. And then any distinction between those who actually exercise power and the purely intellectuals ones, no, not really, not that I've been able to detect actually, and I'll have to give more thought to that, but it doesn't strike me that they were acting or they were thinking very differently, among the ones who really exercised power and the one who didn't, but I'll have to give it more thought.
Thank you. All right. We'll open it up for questions. If you could, in Wilson Center tradition, state your name and affiliation if you like, and we'll try to accommodate as many arms as possible. So we'll start over here on the...
I'm looking forward to reading.
Could you please wait for the microphone, since we're webcasting live and otherwise you won't be heard. All right.
I'm looking forward to reading your book, and
Could you state your name?
Okay. Jim Dubnan, a retired academic.
Thank you.
Looking forward to reading your book. It sounds extremely interesting. I'll try to be very brief, but there seems to be the sort of the forebears of the neocons. The New York intellectuals also had three families. And the first one, as was mentioned, was the alcoves of City College in the 30s, and then later became crystallized around partisan review, anti-Stalinist left. And it seems to be interesting parallels because there are also, when you pick up the story in the 60s, among the New York intellectuals, whom included from C.C. White, Daniel Bell, founded the Public Interest, Irving Kristol, later, patriarch of the neocons, Nathan Glaser and Irving Kristol and Irving Howe. The 60s, again, the New Left was central, and the schism within the New York intellectuals, almost all of the first families opposing the New Left vehemently, except for exceptions like Dwight McDonald and a few others. But the third generation, including, ironically, Norman Podhoretz, at first in the early 60s, was very sympathetic to what became the counterculture, friend of Norman Mailer and so forth. And you see this complete switch around from Norman Podhoretz and others, almost like a Freudian kind of psychoanalytic kind of repudiation of what they felt ashamed of when they were younger.
Thank you. Justin?
Do we take a couple
No, go ahead.
questions,
I'd like immediate dialogue.
Sure. No. That's a very interesting point. Podhoretz was younger, obviously, by a few years than the others, than Kristol and Bell and Glaser, and the others. And yes, he did undergo a phase of mild radicalism, you could call it, in around 1962, 64, 66. But then had a very strong turn. In after 67 and more pointedly after 1970, and this is maybe too sort of fine an analysis of Norman Podhoretz's every move for the rest of the public, but I do think he stands apart precisely because of this phase that he had not been a radical during his youth, but sort of underwent a radical phase in the 1960s, and after all, in Commentary, when finally he was able to become the editor of Commentary, edited and published a number of articles on poverty and a number of thinkers of the New Left. As for the divisions, by definition, New York intellectuals are divisive or are prone to divisions, and without going into the sort of the intricacies of the debate, I would probably just point to sort of more or less two groups. One that really the protest against Vietnam and student revolt was really a key to that, because obviously many of those who had been in the alcoves of the City College of New York, etc., and had risen to prominence, not only to fame for some of them, but also to material well-being and recognition, etc. We're seeing that the instruments of their rise and meritocracy and working hard and being recognized in the intellectual field was being sort of trashed by younger students of the baby boom generation who were seemingly unaware of the luck that they had, and so this contributed in no small part in their reaction against the New Left and all these spoiled kids, whether from Berkeley or at Columbia or at Cornell or other places, whom they saw as sort of a new Stalin, not communist, but precisely Stalinist danger for them. So basically, two reactions. These ones who turned right. Some of them didn't go very far on the right. I'm thinking of Dan Bell, for example, who really never became a conservative of any sort. But also others, you mentioned Irving Howe, for example, and so others welcomed the New Left, or at least tried to build bridges with the new generation and try to accommodate their views and integrate their views and sort of charted a different course. And of course, the battle was on the legacy of liberalism. Where would be the center of gravity of liberalism? And obviously, that second group that Michael Harrington and others sort of found accommodation with the New Left, remained the true liberals, whereas the others finally drifted to conservatism in one way or the other.
Thank you, Pete. Well, can you bring the microphone down here to the gentleman in the brown shirt, but I want to take a question from over there. I think there were some on the left side. The young lady here in the center there.
I'm sorry.
Hi, my name's...
Let me go first over here, and then we'll... Name, please, as well.
Okay. Rebecca Chamberlain, Woodrow Wilson Center, Kennan Institute. I also confess to not having read the book yet, but my curiosity is a relationship, the neocons' connection to religion over these ages and these different families. And I guess it's interesting because when we think of today with G.W. Bush's, his, for example, the National Security Council, we think of the Christian far right. So I'm just wondering what that relationship has been, or any religious relationship over these ages with the different sort of families.
Thank you.
Very interesting, very interesting and tough question because of the diversity of relations and most, to make a very broad generalization, most neoconservatives would generally have quite a distance with religion, whether they're Jews, many of them are Jews, and sometimes being interested in it, like Irving Kristol, for example, but not being practitioners and not very strong adherents. I would say. Certainly some of them being very strong defenders of Jews in general. Norman Podhoretz, for example, in the turn that I was describing earlier in 1970, starts with questioning, after the war in 1967 and all of that, starts with asking the question, is it good for the Jews? So it's really not about religion, but more about ethnicity, if you'd like, and a worry about the specific group, but most others being basically agnosticist, as far as I can tell, and not talking much about religion at all. You had a majority of Jews and Catholics among them. Jean Kirkpatrick is a good example. William Bennett and many others. Fewer Protestants, but what unites them, the common point is a great distance with religion, apart from some of those who are more devoted Jews, but they're in a minority.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, my name's Dan Lieberman. Two short questions. I heard Bill Kristol at that Brookings meeting. He was asked the question, is neocon still alive? And he said, well, while he's still alive, the neocons are still alive. So first question is, you said neocons are still going, but where are they going? And the second thing, you talked about the relation between the neocons and Israel, and you provided some questions on that. And it seems that one thing that the neocons do coalesce around is Israel. They all seem to coalesce around Israel. So it leads me to wonder, has Israel co-opted the neocons to favor Israel, or are neocons people who favor Israel who have co-opted policies in favor of Israel?
Yeah, still going. Yeah, obviously, and I have a paper for those interested in the more recent aspects of neoconservatism. I have a paper on the Brookings website, which you can find easily, which is called "Why Neoconservatism Still Matters," and which, in effect, argues that they are still around because of the number of people who are writing, because of their position in magazine, think tanks, foundations, etc., and because of their influence on the Republican Party as well. Where are they going? Well, there's nothing really new compared with, let's say the first article that was the rebirth of the movement in 1995 by Kristol and Kagan, which was entitled Towards a Neo-Reaganite Foreign Policy. That was for the campaign of 1996, and so they were advocating what they were describing or labeling neo-Reaganite, and it was really about, the 5 pillars I described. You would find all of them in that article, and since then there's not been a lot of innovation, if you like, and so where are they going? Well, to the to apply the same principles to other issues. America should be strong, should shape world order. It should not be tied down by treaties, etc. So, nothing really new here under the sun. Israel played a role for the evolution of some of them, and I was mentioning 1967, and then let me just describe to you, because that's another page of history of the Cold War that is really interesting. before June 1967, many Jews in the U.S., most Jews were liberals, still are, as a matter of fact, but they were strongly liberals, and many of them were among the ranks of the New Left, and many of them were very strong opponents of the war in Vietnam. And then after the war in June and the sort of near miss that had happened, and it ended up as a victory for Israel, but not after the real perception of vital threat for Israel. And so after that particular episode and the fact that many in the Third World rallied against Israel and in favor of the Arab nations that Israel was at war with, led many of them to reconsider their position about American power and basically to advocate support for that democracy that had almost been wiped off the map by the Arab nations. And so they found themselves in a situation where on the one hand, they were advocating retreat from Vietnam, and on the other hand, engagement for Israel. And so they were dubbed dogs or hoves, a mix of hoax and doves. And there was in the archives there's that famous quote by LBJ at some point after June 67, where he say, if the rabbis. They want me to. They wouldn't let me send a single screwdriver to Vietnam, but they want me to put the whole Fifth Fleet in the Gulf of Aqaba, and so that sort of illustrates the idea that this war in the 6 Day War was really a sort of a wake-up call that changed the perceptions of many in the Jewish community away from their sort of very staunchly new left and liberal and new politics position towards a reconsideration of what American power could be used for and basically to defend democracies, and not only Israel but others, and defend more generally American interest across the globe. So that played, for some of them, that played a role after 1967. Then there were other episodes, but the bottom line is, as Gary Dorian, who's another author on the subject, wrote very eloquently about 10 years ago on the neoconservative movement, support for Israel is one of the key components for most of them. Of course, it would remain to be seen how different it is from other groups. After all, support for Israel is not the preserve of neoconservatives, and it's widely shared. So, of course, it would be interesting to see how more strongly these would support Israel compared with others. But so it's an essential component. Zionism, if you'd like, is an essential component of neoconservatism, but it's not the key for everything else in the sense that if you take current neoconservatives, let's say, the Foreign Policy Initiative, which has opened a year ago and which is sort of the new PNAC, the new Project for the New American Century, they're not Israel-centered at all. If you take the Project for the New American Century itself between 1997 and 2006, they were not Israel-centered at all. If you take, for example, Robert Kagan, who's probably the most prominent neoconservative thinker, he has devoted very little time to Israel and is not known for making staunchly pro-Israel declarations. So my point is that, yes, Israel fits in at different moments in the movement and is indeed important, but more generally the defense of smaller allies and other democracies is important in general, and Israel being one of them. And that wouldn't be, defense and support for Israel wouldn't be the key to understanding the rest of the movement, if you'd like. And just recently, a week ago, with the flotilla incident, if you read Max Boot's commentary on that, I don't know if you did, on the on Commentary magazine, on Contentions, which is Commentary magazine blog, he was very restrained. He was striking a very sort of different tone from the let's say unconditional defenders of Israel. So yes, bottom line, yes, it occupies an important role, but it's not the key to everything else.
Thank you. Fascinating. Dawn, and then Christina will go down to some of the folks down here, also in the alcove. There were a couple of hands. Dawn.
Thank you. I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center. I've enjoyed all of your presentations. I want to go back to basics because I, too, have not read the book. But really, there are a number of neoconservatives, or so-called, that do not like the term, have sort of distanced themselves from that. Sam mentioned Pat Moynihan. I believe Robert Kagan claims doesn't consider himself a neoconservative. I think one of the last interviews with Irving Kristol, he said he didn't like being called a neoconservative and so on. I'm just wondering, who coined the term neoconservative? If you look at the origins, it's obviously from people that turned against Trotskyism and were disillusioned by the Soviet Union and Stalinism and so on. There is an anti-authoritarian strain that runs throughout these three families, whether you're talking about social engineering by the government trying to remake society, or whether you're talking about foreign threats from authoritarian regimes or whatever. To me, they could just as easily have been called neoliberals or classical liberals or whatever, as opposed to neoconservative. But who coined this term, and how did it stick?
Yeah, very interesting question. There are a couple of, I did some in-depth research about this because I can give you two answers, the conventional wisdom and the legend, or the true answer. I'll start with the conventional wisdom, which is that Michael Harrington coined the terms in 1972 and 72-73, and it was supposed to be in common use, in his in the circles that he was associated with at the time, and supposedly to, as I mentioned in my earlier presentation, to sort of banish these new intellectuals from the ranks of liberalism. Actually, if you look back in time, several people used the term before that, including Robert Bartlett, who was the editor of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages as early as 1970, to talk about Norman Podhoretz, Irving Kristol, and others, saying that he was looking for, that was a group that existed and stood for something, but that they lacked a good label. And so he was, should they be called neo-Whigs or neoconservatives is one of the suggestions that he makes. And Norman Podhoretz, claimed that he used himself 10 years before in 1962, that he used himself the term. But bottom line, the truth is that it's more interesting to understand why. The second part of your question, why did it stick? And obviously it stick only during the course of the 1970s when a number of publications, number of articles in the Washington Post, in Time magazine, and others used the term. And it really didn't become of larger use before 1979, probably, when Peter Steinfeld wrote his book about the neoconservatives, the men who are changing America, or something like that. Always applied to the same group. But obviously then it stuck and remained for the 1980s. But then when it got back in fashion, which was after 2001, it was really in conjunction with the Iraq War, and that's only when the public started catching up on the phrase neocons, and when you had 1,000 conspiracy theories blossoming all around the web.
Thank you. Yes, and if you could pass the microphone to the gentleman next to you, Pete, there. Yeah.
Oh, my name is Stephen Shore. A wonderful presentation. Two brief questions. The first is, how important to the neoconservative mind is what is tactfully called the belief in American exceptionalism, or less tactfully called the Gott mit uns attitude? And the second question is, was there not a neocon effort to focus on terrorism in the late 70s? I remember Claire Sterling, where she basically attributed every unsolved violent crime in Turkey, or the Pope's the attempted assassination of the Pope, to communist training camps in Eastern Europe. So I don't know if she's in your book or not.
As a matter of fact, she's not. But that's. I'll start with the second point. It's very. It's very true. You had a number of neoconservatives taking part in conferences as early as 79 and 80. In various places about terrorism. But the big difference with, Sam mentioned earlier the fact that they were not focusing on terrorism. They were not focusing on non-governmental terrorism, which is, of course, the one that counts now since 9/11, or even, since 96, 98 in Africa, etc. That is Al-Qaeda type terrorism, if you'd like. They were concentrating on state-sponsored terrorism. And obviously, if you remember, the first reaction after 9/11 of people like Paul Wolfowitz was ending states that support terrorism. So it was really about states and sort of reapplying a state-centered framework on something that was, basically about NGOs, if you like Al-Qaeda and other groups. So yes, they did concern themselves with terrorism briefly because it was seen as being sponsored by the USSR and some Arab regimes, but not in the sense that would sort of develop in the 90s and 2000s. And exceptionalism is central to their vision. And I argue in sort of trying to give an interpretation of the three families, however different they are, that patriotism or nationalism is one sort of common point between them. For the first generation, it was really a reaction against the attack against the American experience by the counterculture, the student protest, the New Left, etc. And so it's really a reaction against against the attack against exceptionalism, if you'd like. For the second generation, it was really, and there are great quotes that I use in the book, either by Kirkpatrick or by Norman Podhoretz, about how Vietnam was not important in itself. So it was not just about Vietnam, it was really about the reaction against the reaction to Vietnam. That is, they were reacting against the overreaction to Vietnam, and Podhoretz explains that whether one was right or wrong about Vietnam, at some point it became a question of putting in question the moral character of the U.S., and that's when they really started to react. And so, once again, the exceptionalism, nationalism, etc. And of course, the most recent neocons, for them also, patriotism is key. Sometimes they've been called national greatness conservatives, and which explains that their position, to make the link with a previous question, the position vis-à-vis government intervention is not clear-cut. That is, they're not against all government intervention because, as Crystal and David Brooks put it 10-15 years ago, if Americans don't like their government, how could they like their country? So here there's a sort of the soft spot of neoconservatives in their relationship with the larger conservative movement, where you can dissociate government and love, patriotism, etc. But at some point, you have to have a government in order to stand and represent that country, and neoconservatives are very much in favor of that, even if it means extending the size of government.
Thank you. Jim and Sam, you should feel free to chime in at any one point, especially if you disagree.
No, I don't. I would draw the question was about American exceptionalism, and there is a shade of difference between what I think has been core neoconservative thought, which is that America is a force for good in the world. The earliest generations of neoconservatives were reacting against the Vietnam War protests, that America is overall a force for good. There is a shade of difference between that and exceptionalism, which is that the United States has a divine mission, is unique and different from other countries in its very nature and in its foreign policy. And I don't know. I will leave to Justin whether that was there at the beginning. I tend to link that to Reagan more than to the 60s, 70s neoconservatives. And now it's taken, from Reagan on, it's taken on a life of its own, so that you can actually find quotes from Sarah Palin saying, "I believe in American exceptionalism," or Barack Obama is wrong for not believing in American exceptionalism as she interprets it. So it's become something that's formally embraced. I would ask whether you think the idea of divine mission, which goes back to John Winthrop, but whether that was there in the 60s and 70s.
Why don't we take another question over here, if you could please state your name, too.
Alan Kraut. I teach history at American University here in town. It's a two-part question. One is about the philosophic underpinnings of the movement. I mean, aside from the anti-Stalinists in the alcove of the City University, my alma mater, there was, after all, other ideas afoot. The ideas of Leo Strauss, to an extent Milton Friedman. And I'm wondering to what extent those remain important to neoconservatives? In other words, is there a body of philosophic, historic thought that remains important? So that's part one. Part two is, if the day should come when there was peace in the Middle East and the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, given the differences within the Republican Party and within, even among neoconservatives, on the size of government and the function of government, what would be the glue that would make this more than a three-generation moment in American political history?
Yeah, these are great questions, and I hope the other panelists will address them. As for Leo Strauss, I take a somewhat probably exaggerated view that Leo Strauss matters almost not at all. That is, I really start from an historian working in the archives and trying to make sense of, what decisions, and, which is the $1,000 question of political scientists and historians alike. That is to say, how can you trace the influence of ideas on actual decisions through, networks of people who, knew each other, developed same thinking, and when they come to government, in balance with many other sources of policy making, how ideas can find themselves, can have an actual impact, and so and more generally, how much of Leo Strauss counted in forging the minds, I would say, of neoconservatives, if we just leave aside even the impact on the policy process, and the answer to both questions is quite. The influence was quite small. A few neoconservatives are Straussians. Not all of them, definitely not all of them. Paul Wolfowitz, for example, went to Chicago to study with Leo Strauss, but ended up being influenced much more by Albert Hofstadter rather than Leo Strauss, and was not that interested in Strauss. And so you have a convergence of some sorts between some of Strauss's ideas and that of the neocons, but it's very, very, very small sort of overlap. I'll just end up my answer to this question by quoting Kagan. He explains that his view, Robert Kagan, were shaped by those of his father, and an historian like him, I can relate to that, who was arguing endlessly with Alan Bloom at Cornell, where he was a professor on Strauss's interpretation of the Republic by Plato, and basically the Kagan father and son deem Strauss to be fundamentally wrong because he's historical. That is, he believes that there are discussion between the great minds, the great philosophical minds across time. And of course, that's completely against the basic instincts of historians who think that the thinking is done in specific context. And so he explains, and I want to quote him on that. Kagan explains, "I just want to make clear that I'm not a Straussian. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Some of my closest friends are Straussians, and I've long admired the works of Alan Bloom, Harry Jaffa, Harvey Mansfield, and Thomas Pangle. Though not, I must say, Leo Strauss himself, since I never understood a word of the political philosopher wrote. I mean, not a single word." And so
That sounds a lot like Don Kagan.
So for this reason and others, I've devoted very little, and you'll see in the index, I think there are 2 occurrences of Leo Strauss, because I think it really doesn't explain much. The second question, and maybe I'll leave my co-author, is a very good one to which I would have to give more thought. But to what extent can you consider that, that you could still use the same label for people as different as Nathan Glazer and Doug Feith, for example? Not to demean any of them, but there are strong differences that you could make the point that neoconservatism doesn't exist, just a label, and it's maybe unfortunate that the same one was applied to so different people.
Jim, Sam, on this issue? Otherwise, let's go to this gentleman, and then let's take a couple of questions there. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm Norman Birnbaum from Georgetown University, and I have a little bit of difficulty in even asking a question since I wrote for Commentary and was an editor of Partisan Review and knew all these people. My father was even the dean at Benjamin Franklin High School, who urged Pat Moynihan not to go to the docks, but to go to City College. So when Norman Podhoretz wrote about this whole being a matter of family in his famous book, Making It, I belong to the family. But I think that there is first of all, Justin, congratulations. You've provided Gaullist revenge for all those American books mapping the Parisian intellectuals by turning the tables on us in a way that is definitive. Secondly, I think it is possible probably to write several histories of the neoconservatives, to go back even further, let's say to the post-war discussions, to the famous Symposium and Partisan Review in '53, My Country and My Culture, in which American exceptionalism was indeed espoused. But one train does seem to me, or one chain of causation, at least for the New Yorkers and I think for some others too, is important, namely social mobility. If you want to put it crudely, it's hard to imagine now that in 1945, when that generation came back from the war, nobody could have possibly imagined that the presidents of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Williams, Amherst would one day be Jewish. In fact, there were very, very few Jewish professors at these places, and also extremely few Catholics who suffered, particularly in Brahmin New England, more than a certain amount of discrimination. And so that to some extent, the realization that America had opened up after the war was terribly important to these people and made Trotskyism seem like even more of an aberration than it might seem to normal perception. And this, I think, came to some extent to their consciousness, not alone with the struggle over the Vietnam War, but with an episode that's little thought of, the New York City school strike of 1967, which opposed the Jewish-led teachers' union to local community boards who were Latino and black. I'm sure you've got it. I haven't.
Ocean Hill, Burnsville.
Yes. But I think it played a terribly important role, at least for Podhoretz. By the way, about religion, Podhoretz went to Columbia, not to City College, and parallel to that, he took studies at Jewish Theological Seminary for quite a long time, and was quite versed in the Old Testament. But I do think that this sense of an opportunity society, so to speak, with themselves, of course, seizing the opportunities and making themselves major figures in the public eye, was terribly important psychologically and culturally for these people. Was certainly also true for people like for Pat Moynihan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Since you provoked me on my Frenchness, I would mention an anecdote that happened to me just this morning. Harvard University Press has contracted with a firm that has committed to booking me on 20 radio shows across the country. And so what I discovered, I sort of knew it, but I discovered that that radios in the U.S. are extraordinarily polarized politically. And so I'm either with talk show hosts that are staunch conservatives or staunchly liberals. And so this morning it was a show in Texas, and the guy was very, very conservative. And so at one point in the discussion, he alluded to the fact that I was French and asked me if I was here legally. And so it was all the more striking that the conversation had been rather pleasant until then, and so I decided to laugh, and so we laughed as well. So it ended well, but it was kind of striking. Anyway, social mobility, and yeah, that's very important. But precisely, I think it's because of this social mobility, and by the way, Podhoretz himself went to Columbia, as you mentioned, under a quota, a Jewish quota, limiting the number of Jews allowed to be admitted at Columbia, and these quotas were lifted only in the course of the 1950s. I think the quota was 7 or 10%, something like that. So yes, social mobility was and that's why they cannot become complete conservatives, and this is why they cannot be fully National Review conservatives. And also another reason is that Irving Kristol explains that the experience of his youth when he saw all the idle factories during the New Deal, and the idea that government shouldn't do anything and should let private business take care of everything was of course something that didn't appeal to him. Anyway. It's true that, interestingly, Jews and Catholic make up a large part of the neocons, and they are precisely the ones who were, and also people from the, not the Northeast, but sometimes from, people like Jane Kirkpatrick from Oklahoma and the South and the Southwest and various places like that. So not people from the establishment, but people who sort of had conquered the establishment, and we're seeing WASPs, young students reject the very tools that had helped them succeed, and so had definitely mixed feelings about this.
All right, we have a number of people who'd like to ask questions, and time is running out fast. So, if you actually, the gentleman right behind, and we'll take a few questions at the same at one time now, just to make progress here a little bit.
Thank you.
Yep.
My name is Miguel Benito. No particular affiliation. Congratulations for the presentations; they're very interesting, and I'm quite excited to read the book. The question is about the future of the movement. We're talking about the movement in the United States, but have you seen the influence of the neoconservative ideas and movement outside the States? Because in some other countries there are a strong neoconservative thinkers, and they are organizing themselves and starting to get some influence in the political context. So, have you seen some of that?
Great question. Thank you, gentlemen. 2 seats down. Yep.
Norman Fulton with Metro State College of Denver. You stated a little bit about neoconservatives being passionate about defense spending. I was wondering if that includes defense spending domestic as well as international, and maybe you could speak a little bit about what a neoconservative position might be on the current situation in Iraq and Afghanistan.
All right, the gentleman right next to you in the black shirt.
Tyler Henson, Metro State College of Denver. Same with him. My question also has to deal with the foreign policy of if there's any factions created in the neocons with use of privatized military forces overseas.
Great. Then we'll go all the way to the back. No, the gentleman behind you in the last row. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mason. I just wanted to push you a bit on the question of Leo Strauss and Mr. Kristol. If you look throughout most of Irving Kristol's writings, he seems to adopt Strauss's crisis of modernity, almost concept for concept. If you look at Strauss's entire history of Western political thought, the idea that there was a rupture with the advent of Hobbes and Machiavelli and Spinoza. If you read Kristol's accounts, when he goes back any further than 1960, it seems to be strikingly Straussian. And also his son, William Kristol, if we think about the third family, he was influenced by Harvey Mansfield, who was his supervisor over at Harvard, who was an avowed Straussian. And I was wondering if in general the neocon critique of liberalism as a kind of decadent philosophical body is not in some way related to Strauss's critique of liberalism as potentially corrupted by virtue of positivism and historicism. And you see these two ideas also manifesting in a lot of the other neocon writers. This fear and reluctance of scientific thought influencing what was once this pristine political philosophy that the West was preoccupied with. And so I was wondering if you could address those issues.
Thank you, and we'll go to the gentleman. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Jim Lowen, I wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, among other things. I have the Republican Party into which these folks are moving, meanwhile, has gone through a transformation on race, from being the party of Wendell Willkie and for that matter, Everett Dirksen, to, of course, the party of Strom Thurmond and these two Paul folks. And I wonder if you wanted to talk about the racial views of the neoconservatives and how they changed and how they fit in with the Republicans.
All right. 5 questions, 5 minutes, Justin. We'll have a little more time for more questions. Go ahead.
Sure. No, I'll do my best. Yeah, the question of neoconservatism outside U.S. borders is a fascinating one. But basically, my first reaction is the particular circumstances that created the neoconservative movement, and in its different phases, have not really been found in exactly the same way elsewhere. Just to take, as just by chance, France as an example. In the 1970s, you had a reaction against Mai 68 and the student revolt, etc., with the new philosophers, with Glucksmann, Bernard-Henri Lévy, and others. And yeah, obviously, you could trace Alain Finkielkraut. You could trace a sort of echo of what had happened in the U.S., but it's really no more than an echo. Then, maybe another way to look at it would be more recently in terms of foreign policy, the idea that you should, that the West should be forceful and defend democracy, etc. That you would find with people like José María Aznar in Spain and others. Yeah, you could use the word neocons, or in Great Britain you would find a couple of them, but it doesn't. You really have to be American to sort of be a neocon, and I think that in other countries it can only be used metaphorically, if you'd like, and it's oftentimes used pejoratively for describing people you disagree with and you think are too hawkish. But I don't see any depth of other neoconservative movement on spending and how Iraq and Afghanistan are going. The one great thing about neoconservatives is that they write everything they think, and far from being Straussian in the sense that they would, hide what they are thinking because the layman cannot understand, and speaking by signs, etc. They really it's an open book or an open review, and an open commentary, Weekly Standard, the Wall Street Journal, the some pages of the New Republic, and elsewhere, and so it's very easy to see what they think about Iraq and Afghanistan. But basically, on Iraq, they think that that the search has been going well, that some of prominent neoconservatives, for example, Frederick Kagan from the American Enterprise Institute, was one of the forces behind the idea of the surge, and he's Robert Kagan's brother, and so things are going better on this side, even though some of them. You remember that session, like Georges Moravcsik made their mea culpa. Yes, Iraq didn't turn out the way we had envisaged, but first, it was not entirely our fault because Don Rumsfeld didn't put enough troops, and second, we had forcefully advocated putting more troops, and third, we made a mistake, and he was pretty straightforward about this. On privatized military forces, no specific thinking, but these guys tend to be pretty patriotic and to sort of insist on the also the sort of civic virtues of a sort of national greatness foreign policy, and so this doesn't always square well with the ideas that others have about private military forces. On Neo-Strauss, these are good points, and Irving Kristol quotes many other thinkers, Tocqueville among them, for example, as the sources, and it's and as Bill Kristol put it to me when I interviewed him back in 2001, I think, so it was 9 years ago. There are ideas that are congruent or that are an echo of Strauss, but there's not necessarily a direct link, and certainly his work on the separation of powers at the end of the 70s with Harvey Mansfield at Harvard didn't really, he said so himself, didn't really have any kind of impact on his thinking. And on race, the interesting thing is that you have at least 4 or 5 future neoconservatives that I was able to detect that took part in the march of August 1963, the March on Washington by Martin Luther King, whether they were very young, like Georges Moravcsik, for example, who had helped put leaflets in envelopes and helped the organization. Also, what was his name again? Moravcsik, close associate. His name escaped. Penn Campbell, thanks, who was very active and walked there, also at a very young age, although he was a bit older, etc. And so they were not, and Podhoretz is something different. We would need a whole session of 4 hours to come to grips with that. But basically, the bottom line is that they were supporters, most of them were supporters of the civil rights movement, and what they opposed was really busing and quotas, and this was related to a number of various ideas. And once again, I mentioned this in the book, but basically, I remember that when Strom Thurmond, and I'm getting tired, when Strom Thurmond had his 100th birthday, and Trent Lott made his famous comments, the first one who attacked Lott were neoconservatives. They were people like Max Boot, if I remember well, Charles Krauthammer, etc. And this was sort of an echo of a slightly different vision of neoconservatives compared with other conservatives, without generalizing too much. But this was an echo of their particular stance. After all, there are many of them, not all of them, but many of them are universalists.
All right, we'll have time for just a couple more questions. Anybody who can't live without having asked this questions? Okay, one. Anybody else? Okay, we'll have the final question over there.
Dave Rogers, independent historian. On another angle of this racism issue, I would like your view on the idea that the contemporary the idea of racism in the contemporary neoconservative thought that a superior America is going to impose on inferior peoples what we think is good for them, whether they like it or not. I mean, I raise this question because it seems to me there is a direct connection between the neocon idea of originally making Iraq into a new crusader state with manifest destiny to justify despoiling the Mexicans, McKinley justifying the conquest of the Philippines by a civilizing mission, and Woodrow Wilson declaring that he was going to use brute force to teach the Latin Americans how to elect good people.
All right, and final question over there.
Ramsey Scott, Metropolitan State College of Denver. I just as far as the future of the neocons in a Tea Party-influenced Republican Party, what do you see for them? I mean, I know there's similar points, very strong. They both believe in a very strong American defense, but budgets, that sort of thing, are definitely a contrast. What do you see their future in a Tea Party-influenced Republican Party?
Good question to end on. All right, Justin.
On race, one of the other interesting, the whole experience of writing the dissertation and then the book was that it also eliminated many aspects of the American society that I didn't really know that well. And one of the great discoveries is the biography and the life of Bayard Rustin. And interestingly, Bayard Rustin was very active, and he was a founding member of the Coalition for Democratic Majority, and he was very active in Jewish Americans, Black Americans relations, and he was also a big defender of democracy. For example, in 1977, if my memory serves me well, he is going to Rhodesia to monitor the elections, the first free elections there, and sort of report on the status of democracy in Rhodesia, which will become Zimbabwe afterwards, and so this is a whole different aspect of American life in turbulent times that I encountered. That was speaking about turbulences. On imposing democracy, well, the neocons would answer. Why have they defended intervening on behalf of Somalians? Why have they intervening on behalf of Bosnians, for example, on behalf of Afghans, obviously, to defend them? And I'm going to get an electric shock of some sort. And so they would argue that that precisely against the conservative view, the culturalist conservative view that democracy is only for basically for Western people or white people, etc. They have the belief that democracy is for everybody, and that it's one of the comparisons that I'm drawing between their universalism and that of the, some of the French revolutionaries, some of the Jacobins, mixing militarism and idealism and sort of spreading les droits de l'homme and the message of the French Revolution by force. Sorry about that. What if my notes didn't drone? I can get back
take
to
on the Tea.
the Tea Party and the future of the Republican movement. Well, obviously that. Do you want?
I'll relieve you on just for 30 seconds on the neoconservatives and the Tea Party. There was, I think, tremendous ambivalence in the 2008 campaign from neoconservatives on Sarah Palin, and now on the Tea Party. I mean, on the one hand, as this whole book describes, neoconservatives are an intellectual movement, and there's a strong bit of more than a strong bit of anti-intellectualism from the Tea Party, and so there sometimes, and I've seen a couple of Wall Street Journal commentaries about, in fact, Podhoretz may have written one of them on Palin, praising Palin or praising the Tea Party. Beneath the surface, there's a lot of conflict about that.
And you mentioned Rand Paul, but there were some barbs that were exchanged when Sarah Palin defended Rand Paul, the son, in his quest to become the Republican nominee for senator, because she defended him, but then the neocons, who sort of, Bill Kristol was instrumental in discovering her, if you'd like, and pushing her candidacy with John McCain in 2008, and then Randy Schoenemann, who was one of the advisors for a McCain campaign in 2008, is now her main foreign policy advisor. So, it would seem that there's quite a bit of affinities between Palin and the neocons, but then she threw a support behind a number of Tea Party insurgents, and these guys, especially Paul, father and son, are on the record criticizing the Iraq War, opposing the Iraq War, opposing interventionism, defending a smaller defense budget, etc., and that really causes tensions, and of course it would be very interesting to see how it's resolved depending on who gets the nomination in 2012.
Thank you. I think, Justin, you can take the enormous interest among this group, and I think our viewers on the web as well, as an indication that you've written a very important book. Congratulations. Thank you to you for the answering for 2 hours questions. Thanks to Sam and to Jim for some excellent comments that got the discussion going. Thank you all for your questions and comments. I'd like to invite all of you, after a round of applause, for our panelists and those of you who are over 21, to a glass of, continue the conversation over a glass of wine, some cheese outside. So thank you.